Robert F. Kennedy was born into one of the most powerful families in America, but he was never meant to be the brightest star. He was the quiet son, the overlooked son, the boy his own father doubted. Yet somehow, he became the man standing beside a president, fighting the mafia, challenging corruption, speaking for the poor, and carrying the broken hopes of a wounded nation. But on one summer night in Los Angeles, just as his dream of becoming president began to feel real, everything ended in a hotel kitchen. This is the story of Robert F. Kennedy, the forgotten Kennedy son who almost changed America. Before Robert F. Kennedy became a symbol of hope, before crowds screamed his name, before America saw him as the man who might heal a wounded country, he was simply Bobby, the quiet Kennedy son no one expected to lead. He was born into one of the most powerful families in America, a family where ambition was not just encouraged, but almost demanded. The Kennedys were wealthy, disciplined, competitive, and intensely aware of their place in the world. Around their dinner table, children were not allowed to drift through childhood lazily. They were expected to discuss history, politics, public life, and the great questions of the day. In that house, greatness was not treated as a dream. It was treated as a family duty. But even in a family built for power, Bobby often seemed to stand in the shadows. He was the seventh of 9 children. Born after stronger, louder, more promising sons had already claimed attention. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., had grand plans for the family, but those plans seemed to rest mostly on the shoulders of the older boys, Joseph Jr. and John. Bobby, by comparison, was seen as smaller, quieter, less commanding. His father dismissed him as the weak one, the runt of the family, a boy who did not appear destined for greatness. For a child in an ordinary home, that might have been painful enough. But in the Kennedy household, where achievement was everything, being underestimated cut deeply. Bobby did not have the easy charm that John Kennedy seemed to possess. He was not naturally graceful in society. As a teenager, he was moved from one boarding school to another, never staying long enough to build lasting friendships or feel completely settled. The constant change made him withdrawn. He became awkward, serious, and sometimes painfully shy. Yet beneath that quiet surface was something hard and unbreakable. Those who knew him as a boy noticed that Bobby hated defeat. If he failed at something, he did not simply accept it. He came back harder. If he was mocked, he tried again. If he felt small, he pushed himself to become stronger. He may not have been the most dazzling Kennedy son, but he had a stubbornness that would later define his entire life. His first glimpse of the wider world came not from a grand political stage, but from an ordinary job. After leaving school, Bobby worked as a bank clerk in East Boston and traveled there by subway. For a young man born into privilege, those daily journeys showed him something his comfortable upbringing had not: the struggle of ordinary people. He saw workers, tired faces, poverty, and lives far removed from the polished world of Kennedy wealth. Those sights stayed with him. Years later, when he spoke about justice, poverty, and human dignity, it did not come only from political calculation. Somewhere in those early mornings and crowded subway rides, Bobby had begun to understand that America looked very different from the bottom than it did from the top. Then, in 1944, the Kennedy family was struck by tragedy. Joseph Kennedy Jr., the eldest son and the one many believed had been chosen for greatness, was killed while serving in World War II. His death shattered the family. For Joseph Sr., it was not only the loss of a son, but the destruction of a political dream. The hopes once placed on Joseph Jr. now shifted toward John. But Bobby felt the change too. Suddenly, the overlooked son was no longer quite so invisible. The family hierarchy had moved, and Bobby began to receive more attention than before. Not affection in the soft, gentle sense. The Kennedys were not that kind of family, but expectation, pressure, purpose. After brief naval service near the end of the war, Bobby went to Harvard, where he studied political science. He was still not the most glamorous Kennedy, still not the one people naturally watched when he entered a room. But he was learning. He was sharpening himself. He was preparing. Later, he studied law at the University of Virginia, and by 1951, he had entered the United States Department of Justice. At first, his work was serious, technical, and far from the fame that would later follow him. He dealt with cases involving national security, espionage, political fraud, and government corruption. It was the kind of work that suited him. Bobby Kennedy was not yet the public hero. He was not yet the grieving brother. He was not yet the presidential candidate whose final speech would echo through history. He was still becoming. And perhaps that was the secret no one in his family fully saw at first. Bobby Kennedy had not been born as the obvious star. He had been forced to build himself piece by piece, through neglect, rivalry, discipline, grief, and a hunger to prove that the forgotten son could become impossible to ignore. By the early 1950s, Robert Kennedy had begun to understand something important about his own life. He might never be the most charming Kennedy, but he could become the most useful one. His brother John was already rising, handsome, witty, polished, and blessed with the kind of effortless presence that made people look twice. John Kennedy seemed made for public life. Bobby was different. He was sharper around the edges, less relaxed, more intense. Where John could glide through a room, Bobby studied it. Where John smiled easily, Bobby watched carefully. And when the Kennedy family needed someone to fight in the trenches, it was Bobby who stepped forward. In 1952, John Kennedy ran for the United States Senate from Massachusetts. For the Kennedy family, it was more than just a political campaign. It was a test of the family's future. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had already lost one son, and his ambitions had now settled heavily on John. But behind John's polished speeches and public charm, Bobby worked with relentless seriousness. He resigned from the Department of Justice and threw himself into the campaign. He organized, planned, pushed, corrected, and fought for every advantage. He was young, but he had the stamina of a man desperate to prove himself. And when John won, Bobby's own position inside the family changed. For the first time, his father seemed to look at him differently. That victory told Joseph Kennedy something he had perhaps never fully believed before. Bobby was not weak. Bobby was valuable. He could deliver results. And in the Kennedy world, results mattered more than tenderness. But politics did not make Bobby softer. If anything, it made him harder. Soon after John's Senate victory, Bobby joined Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigative subcommittee, which was hunting for communist influence inside American life. The atmosphere in Washington was tense, suspicious, and often ruthless. McCarthy's methods were aggressive, and Bobby eventually became uncomfortable with the way the committee operated. In 1953, he left. It was an early sign of something complicated in him. Bobby could be tough, even severe, but he was not careless. He believed in power, but he also believed power had to be used with purpose. Throughout his life, that tension would follow him. The fighter and the moralist, the loyal Kennedy soldier, and the man slowly searching for his own conscience. His next major role placed him directly in the public eye. As chief counsel for the Senate committee investigating improper activities in labor and management, Bobby went after union corruption and organized racketeering. His most famous target became Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful and combative labor leader. Their confrontations were not polite Washington theater. They were tense, personal, and sometimes bitter. Hoffa was no easy opponent. He was forceful, street smart, and used to intimidation. But Bobby did not back down. In hearing after hearing, he pressed, challenged, questioned, and exposed. The quiet Kennedy boy who had once struggled to find his place was now staring down some of the most powerful men in America. The country noticed. The press began to see Bobby not merely as John Kennedy's younger brother, but as a force in his own right. He was not as smooth as John, not as glamorous, not as easy to love at first glance. But he had a fierce energy that made people pay attention. When he believed someone was corrupt, he went after them with a kind of cold determination that could feel almost frightening. Then came 1960. John Kennedy was running for president, and once again, Bobby became the man behind the campaign. This time, the prize was not a Senate seat. It was the White House. Bobby traveled, organized, gave speeches, handled strategy, and protected his brother's interests with absolute loyalty. He knew every weakness, every threat, every political danger. And he understood that in presidential politics, charm alone was not enough. Someone had to do the difficult work. Someone had to worry. Someone had to fight when the cameras were gone. That someone was Bobby. But the campaign also introduced one of the most bitter rivalries of his life, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson wanted the Democratic nomination himself. When John Kennedy won it instead, Johnson became his running mate. Bobby hated the arrangement. He distrusted Johnson's ambition, his style, and his hunger for power. He even tried to persuade Johnson to refuse the vice presidential nomination, but Johnson would not be moved. From that moment, the dislike between the two men hardened. Still, John Kennedy won the presidency in 1960. America saw youth, glamour, elegance, and a new political age. Behind the bright image of Camelot, however, stood Bobby, intense, suspicious, fiercely loyal, and more powerful than many people realized. When President Kennedy appointed him Attorney General, Washington erupted in criticism. To many, it looked like pure nepotism. Bobby was only 35, and critics argued that he lacked the experience for such a serious position. But Bobby understood the doubts, and instead of pretending they did not exist, he surrounded himself with highly capable lawyers. Then he went to work. As Attorney General, he targeted organized crime with historic intensity, coordinating federal agencies in a serious campaign against the mafia. He also became involved in the growing civil rights struggle, publicly supporting racial equality at a time when America was being torn apart by injustice, protest, and violence. Yet Bobby's record was not simple. He supported civil rights, but he also authorized wiretaps on Martin Luther King Jr. after FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover claimed that King's circle had communist connections. It was one of the darker contradictions of his career, a reminder that Bobby Kennedy was not a saint carved from marble, but a man shaped by fear, loyalty, politics, and the brutal pressures of his time. Then, in October 1962, the world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy relied deeply on Bobby. While military voices pushed for action, Bobby became one of the key figures urging careful negotiation and restraint. His judgment, his closeness to the president, and his ability to move quietly behind the scenes helped lower the temperature between the United States and the Soviet Union. After the crisis passed, John Kennedy reportedly summed up his brother's importance in a simple phrase, "Thank God for Bobby." And by then, it was clear. The forgotten son had become the president's most trusted man. He was no longer merely standing behind his brother. He was helping carry the weight of the world. By the early 1960s, Robert Kennedy had become one of the most powerful men in Washington. But power came with a strange kind of exposure. He was no longer the overlooked son, no longer just John Kennedy's younger brother. no longer the intense campaign worker operating behind closed doors. He was now a public figure in his own right, admired, criticized, watched, and whispered about. The Kennedy name had become almost royal in American life. There was glamour around the family, a sense of youth and brightness, as if the country had entered a new age. But behind that polished image, the Kennedy world was never simple. It was full of pressure, secrets, rivalries, and private storms that the public only partly understood. One of the most talked about figures drawn into that world was Marilyn Monroe. By then, Marilyn was already more than a film star. She was a symbol, beautiful, fragile, magnetic, and surrounded by rumors wherever she went. Her connection to the Kennedy brothers became one of the most controversial stories of the era. After she famously sang Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy in 1962, speculation only grew stronger. But according to later claims, it was Bobby who seemed to hold much of her attention that night. Some people present at the event said Marilyn hardly left his side. One account even claimed she pinned Bobby against a wall in front of his wife, Ethel. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated by gossip, the scene became part of the shadowy mythology around the Kennedys, a world where politics, celebrity, desire, and danger seemed to meet in the same room. For Ethel Kennedy, it was said to be humiliating. She had married Bobby in 1950, built a large family with him, and stood beside him as his life became more public and demanding. Together they had 11 children, a number that seemed almost astonishing given Bobby's own childhood experience of being lost inside a large family. Yet family, duty, Catholic tradition, and Kennedy ambition all remained deeply woven into his private life. Still, America did not see all of that. The public saw the sharp attorney general, the president's trusted advisor, the man fighting organized crime and speaking about justice. But behind the scenes, Bobby was surrounded by contradictions. He could speak passionately about civil rights, yet approve surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. He could present himself as a defender of justice, yet move inside a political world where loyalty often mattered more than purity. He could look like a hard, disciplined public servant, yet his private life was not free from rumors or emotional disorder. Then came the day that changed him forever. On November 22nd, 1963, Bobby Kennedy was at home when the phone rang. The caller was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. His message was brief and brutal. President John F. Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. Before Bobby could properly ask what had happened, Hoover hung up. For a man who had spent years protecting his brother, advising him, defending him, and carrying the hidden weight of his presidency, the news was almost impossible to absorb. John was not only the president, he was Bobby's brother, his closest political partner, and the center of the Kennedy dream. Soon, the terrible truth became official. John F. Kennedy was dead. Something inside Bobby seemed to darken after Dallas. The assassination did not simply grieve him. It changed the way he looked at power, history, and the country itself. The bright confidence of the early Kennedy years was gone. The world now appeared more violent, more uncertain, more morally broken. And to make the wound even deeper, Lyndon B. Johnson, the man Bobby distrusted so intensely, was now president. The vice presidential place was empty, and many wondered whether Bobby might be chosen for the 1964 ticket. But the hatred between Bobby and Johnson made that almost impossible. Johnson chose Hubert Humphrey instead, and Bobby looked for another path. In 1964, he ran for the United States Senate from New York. Critics attacked him immediately. They called him a carpetbagger, a man using a state he had never truly belonged to as a stepping stone for national ambition. But voters saw something else. They saw grief. They saw purpose. They saw a Kennedy trying to continue after tragedy, and Bobby won. When he entered the Senate in 1965, he was no longer merely the brother behind the president. He was becoming something different, a man carrying loss, ambition, anger, and hope all at once. America was changing. Vietnam was tearing the country apart. Civil rights battles were shaking cities and towns. Poverty remained visible beneath the nation's wealth. And Bobby Kennedy, once known for his toughness, began speaking more and more about the wounded, the forgotten, and the powerless. The forgotten son had started listening to forgotten people. By 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was no longer the same man who had once stood quietly behind his brother. The country around him had changed, and so had he. America was exhausted by war, divided by race, shaken by poverty, and haunted by violence. The Vietnam War had become a deep wound in the national conscience. Young men were being sent overseas to fight and die, while at home, cities burned with anger, protest, and grief. Bobby watched it all with growing frustration. He had once been seen as hard, almost ruthless, a man of discipline and attack. But after his brother's death, something in him seemed to open. His speeches became less about power and more about pain. He spoke to poor communities, to Black Americans demanding dignity, to workers, students, and families who felt abandoned by the political class. He was still a Kennedy, still ambitious, still carrying the weight of a famous name. But there was a new urgency in him. He seemed to understand suffering differently now. As the 1968 presidential election approached, Bobby became increasingly unhappy with President Lyndon Johnson's leadership, especially over Vietnam. The war had drained faith from the country, and Bobby believed America needed a different direction, one built around peace, racial justice, economic fairness, and a more humane use of power. On March 16, 1968, he finally announced that he would run for president. It was not simply a campaign. It felt like a test of whether hope could survive in a broken country. His message spread quickly. To many Americans, Bobby represented unfinished business, the promise of the Kennedy years, but changed by grief and sharpened by conscience. He spoke not like a distant politician, but like a man who had known loss personally and now recognized it in others. Crowds gathered not only to hear him, but to touch him, to reach for him, to feel that maybe history had not completely closed the door. Then, in a stunning turn, Lyndon Johnson announced on March 31st that he would not seek re-election. Suddenly, the race changed. Bobby now stood as one of the strongest contenders for the Democratic nomination, competing closely with Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The campaign became intense, emotional, and exhausting. Every victory mattered. Every speech carried the weight of possibility. On June 4, 1968, Bobby won major primary victories in California and South Dakota. For his supporters, it felt like a breakthrough. The road ahead was still difficult, but for one shining moment, it seemed possible that Robert Kennedy might actually reach the White House. Shortly after midnight, he stood before a cheering crowd at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The room was alive with excitement. People clapped, shouted, smiled, and celebrated as if they were witnessing the beginning of something historic. Bobby thanked them. He spoke of the country's direction, of what America could become, of the work still ahead. He looked tired, but hopeful. No one in that ballroom knew they were watching his final public speech. After leaving the stage, Bobby planned to speak to the press. Instead of using the safer route, he moved through a crowded kitchen passageway. Earlier that day, his bodyguard had warned him against taking that route because it was not properly secured. But in the confusion and movement of the night, Bobby went that way. There, in the narrow kitchen corridor, A young hotel busboy named Juan Romero stopped him. Romero admired him deeply. Bobby paused to shake his hand. It was a small gesture, but it revealed something essential about him. At the height of victory, with cameras waiting and history pressing around him, he still stopped for an ordinary worker. Then the moment broke. A 24-year-old man named Sirhan stepped forward with a revolver and opened fire. The kitchen erupted into panic. People screamed. Bodies moved in every direction. Bobby was struck 3 times and fell to the floor. As others wrestled the gunman down, Bobby lay gravely wounded, his campaign, his dream, and perhaps a different future for America collapsing in a matter of seconds. Even then, his first concern was not himself. He asked whether everyone else was all right. Doctors fought to save him. He underwent extensive surgery, but the wounds were too severe. Nearly 26 hours later, Robert F. Kennedy died. He was only 42 years old. The official explanation was that Sirhan acted in retaliation for Bobby's support of Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War. Over the years, however, questions and conspiracy theories continued to surround the assassination, including claims of a second gunman and possible intelligence involvement. But whatever the full truth, one fact remained painfully clear. The Kennedy family had lost another son. America had lost another leader. And millions of people who had looked at Bobby Kennedy and seen a chance for healing were left with the terrible feeling that history had once again turned cruel at the very moment hope seemed closest. Robert Kennedy's life had begun in the shadow of stronger brothers, louder voices, and greater expectations. He had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. But by the end, he had become something rare, a man born into privilege who tried, however imperfectly, to speak for those without it. He was not flawless. He was ambitious, complicated, contradictory, and sometimes severe. But that is what made his story human. Bobby Kennedy did not live long enough to become president. He did not live long enough to finish the journey he had started. Yet his final campaign left behind a question that still lingers. What kind of country might America have become if he had lived?